Alright, in this video I'm going to talk about the section of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason that's known as the Transcendental Aesthetic. And this section of the book is short compared to the rest of the book. But what he's trying to show in the Transcendental Aesthetic is that space and time are not properties of objects in themselves. Uh, and well, I mean, the reason he's doing this is sort of it's it's motivated reasoning, I guess you could say, in that Kant is concerned that the ideas that have come out from people like Isaac Newton, uh, physicists like Isaac Newton and Leibniz, that these physical laws that can be sort of described with mathematics. So the mathematics of the universe. Um, so with mathematics, there's what it was sometimes called the clockwork universe, and the issue that a lot of philosophers came across with this is the problem of determinism and the idea that if everything is able to be predicted so accurately with mathematics that we are in a clockwork universe, then how can we prove that determinism isn't real? How can we prove that that free will exists? And uh, one of the ways that Kant wants to do this is, excuse me, by showing that space and time uh, are not true of things in themselves, of things in themselves. And the reason that this motivates him is because if he can show that space and time are not real, that that space and time are subjective ways um, of the mind organizing reality in a way that is understandable to us, then he can show that mathematics actually stems from this this subjective, uh, this subjective, what he calls a priori or pure intuition of space and time. And so if space and time are a priori or pure intuition, in other words, if these are ways that our mind organizes reality into a way that's understandable to us, then he can show that space and time are subjective, and therefore things in themselves do not have to follow the laws of mathematics, and therefore we don't have the clockwork universe, and therefore he can rescue free will. And so this transcendental aesthetic is motivated by his moral philosophy. He wants to rescue free will in order that we can be moral agents. Uh, and so the transcendental aesthetic, he wants, like I said, he wants to show that space and time are subjective, that they are a priori or pure intuition. Okay, so just to sort of give a little background on the sort of terminology that Kant uses. So he talks about things outside of us. So that would be the thing in itself, or maybe the noumenal thing. But for this purpose, I'm just going to call it the the object, and I am going to show it as something that does have spatial dimensions, even though Kant says that they do not necessarily have spatial dimensions. And so we can say that this here, this box, is the object in itself. And so the appearance of it is what is sort of going towards the subject. So that's the appearance. And when the appearance of it, so I guess you could say the light reflecting off of it, or maybe if we have our hands on it, we can feel it, and the appearance can be basically any of the senses. Uh, Kant, like most philosophers, uses vision almost exclusively as his sense of choice. And so we could say that this appearance is maybe the light that is reflecting off of this. And then when that reaches the subject, he says that is sensation. Sensation. That should be an N. And we'll say that the subject, I'll put that here in kind of a big circle, and this process here is the sensation, and this is when the actual light, when the appearance is actually reaching the subject. So maybe we could say this part here is the eye. And then what Kant has inside, sort of inside the person's mind, is sensibility, which he defines as the capacity to obtain representations. And so representations are the way that we, this, when we see this object, what we're actually seeing in our mind is a representation of it. After this appearance is sensed, then it is represented as some kind of object inside the mind, and this object here is represented inside what's called the intuition. And so for Kant, the intuition is sort of the immediate, so I'll put intuition up here, is the immediate way that this object is affecting us. And so Kant is saying that this intuition requires that there be some sort of criteria. So I'll just move that out here. So criteria, that there has to be some, I guess you could say, shape of intuition, which allows only objects of certain types into it, and that intuition sort of bestows upon the object its shape. So this object looks rectangular because intuition is sort of bestowing upon it its shape. And like I said, this all in sensibility is sort of immediate. This is our sort of direct interaction with the object outside of us. But then what Kant says is we also have something called the understanding, which is sort of our internal way of understanding the world. And so this is filled with concepts. So we can say that these things inside the understanding are concepts. And these are, so concepts can be obtained, that looks bad, obtained either a priori or a posteriori. And so when we obtain concepts, concepts can be obtained a posteriori by when we intuit, when we sense this object, when we represent it, we can then abstract generalities from it. So we could say that this is generalize, so that we generalize it and produce concepts, uh, and concepts are the things that we predicate of subjects. And so we can, if we see this object, say this is object 1, and then we see object 2, 3, 4, and so on, and we can see things that are similar in object 1 to object 2, 3, 4, and so on. Then we can abstract, we can generalize that, and we can say this is a property that is that all of these objects have, and therefore we can turn that into a concept or a predicate. So those are sort of the same concepts and predicates. And then we can say that that if what's the same between all of these is some predicate P, so P is what's similar to 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Then we can say then we can take these objects and we can say that P is predicated of 1, but we could also predicate this of other objects. We could say predicate that of object 77. And so you can generalize and then start predicating this property, this feature of other things, and those are our concepts. Concepts obtained a priori are going to be discussed in more detail in later videos, but those are things that are sort of inside of ourselves that well, I'm not going to get too much into it, but we can understand that there are concepts that we sort of have sort of without having to experience anything in this sort of way. And so this is kind of a rough diagram of the way that Kant understands our way of sensing the world and understanding the world and thinking about the world. What Kant is interested in is this part right here, this immediate intuition, what he calls pure intuition. And so he's interested in this idea of pure intuition as sort of the thing that the condition of our being able to understand objects. And so this is what he says sort of the human mind brings this to bear. The human mind brings this to bear on objects. These are not things that are intrinsic to the objects themselves. So not thing in itself. So as I said, these are the things that the human mind brings to bear. And so Kant wants to show that this is true of space and time, as I've said. So space and time. And so he proffers a few arguments for this. And so the first, he splits his arguments up into two different types. And so the first type he calls the metaphysical, the metaphysical exposition. And this he's sort of trying to show that space and time are an intuition and not a concept gathered from experience. His next part, which I'll talk about after this, is what he calls the Transcendental Exposition, and that is to show that space is a subjective representation that provides the ground for synthetic a priori knowledge. And he has geometry in mind in particular. Um, and uh, so when he talks about the metaphysical exposition, and I will focus on space in particular. I'll go through the arguments for time as well, but they're pretty much derivative of the arguments for space being subjective, being a pure intuition. And so Kant says that when we think about space, we think about things in space relative to the self, and so this is the self, or at least sort of the intuition of the self. This is where things are represented, and so well, I guess we could say this whole diagram will be things represented, and so we think of so if we have object one here, we think about object one uh, as being separate, uh, as being separate from the self. And we also, if we have object two, we understand that as being separate from object one as well as being separate from the self. And that's what space is. And so Newton, Isaac Newton, um, said that space is absolute, and uh, Leibniz said that space is relative, and so the difference between those is that absolute space means that there is even without the self or these objects, there is sort of a, a stage on which this stuff is happening. And this, even if there was nothing in this space would still exist. Whereas Leibniz is, who says that it's relative, says that space doesn't exist unless there are things there to be separate from one another. So this distance here only makes sense if we have two objects that are this distance from each other. And so space is relative. It's just the relative distance of things from each other. Uh, so nowadays, obviously, we have Einstein's relativity, which, well, it's more complicated than I could get into, but it's actually almost sort of a mix of these two. Uh, but uh, but Kant didn't know about Einstein's relativity, so Kant gives a third option for what space is, and that is what we have been talking about, which is that space is everything that is in that, or it's what intuition sort of, as I said, brings to bear on these objects. So we understand these objects as being separate things. Object one is not identical to object two, and neither are identical to the self. And so the intuition, in order to distinguish that these are different objects, sort of imposes space onto our sensation, onto our understanding of this. And so we understand the differences between objects as space. And so that's sort of the idea that Kant is trying to go for. And in his Metaphysical Exposition, he gives four arguments to try and show that this is true. Um, the first argument is essentially saying that in order to represent objects as distinct, then one must represent one thing as outside of another, as I was saying. And in order but he's saying that in order to do this, then I must represent objects in space, and therefore space is a pure intuition. And so he's saying that this idea that if objects are separate, then in order to represent them as outside of one another, then we have to impose this idea, this intuition of space on them. And so space is sort of imposed onto these objects and uh, onto the self uh, as being separate from these things. So that's his first argument. His second argument says that it's impossible to represent the absence of space, but the absence of objects, but not the absence of objects in space. So we can conceive of sort of a big empty space. So this is just space without objects, but we can't think of so that if this is object one and object two, well, we can't think of even a single object without giving it some spatial dimension, some length and width and height and so forth. But we also can't think of objects as separate from one another without thinking of some space between them. And so Kant is saying that there is an asymmetry between being able to represent uh, to represent space as empty of objects, but not objects as empty of space. So he says that knowledge of space, uh, therefore, doesn't come from experience of space, but space is the condition of the possibility of experiences. So, in order for us to even for it to even be possible to experience these objects, space must first exist. Space must be brought to bear first before we can actually start occupying it with these objects. The objects cannot exist without space, and so he's saying that space itself does not come from experience. We don't understand space because we've experienced space. Space is something that we just automatically understand. It's a priori. And so he says that this tells us that space is the form of intuition. Um, in his third argument, his next two arguments take a little bit different of a path, but in the third argument, he says that space is singular, that there is one space, and that is the sort of infinite space in all directions. And so all concepts of space are grounded in this single intuition. So all of these sort of stretch off to infinity. And so he says that all concepts of space are grounded in this single intuition. So the single space in which all concepts of space are grounded is known as the a priori of any concepts of space. So concepts of space are all things that are sort of limitations imposed on space. And so one of Kant's favorite examples is the triangle. And so when we think of the triangle, we are sort of delimiting all of space to just the space that this triangle is occupying. And so this is limiting the infinite singular space to just this part of space and just the sort of properties of space that the triangle has. And so Kant says that these that these concepts are just limitations placed on the intuition of space. And then Kant's fourth argument is one that sort of harkens back to that idea of the genus species concepts that I talked about in the previous video. So concept and concept. So the generic and the specific concepts, where uh, where this genus concept is contained within, and the species concept is contained under. And so Kant talks about that the genus, the general concept, has the what he I think he used the word marks, which could be the features or properties or whatever, that sort of distinguish, that sort of identify everything that is under it. And so maybe we could illustrate this as the general concept is maybe circles that have three dots that look like this in them. And so anything that has this, it can have other things, but if it has this, then it falls under this concept here, this general concept. And so if we have our specific our specific concepts, maybe we have something that's like this, so it has the three dots, but then maybe it also has that in it. And then we have another one that has the three dots, but then it also has something like this in it. And then we have another one here. It has the three dots, but then it also has something like this in it. And so each of these other marks are the differentia that make these different specific concepts, but they all contain these three dots. Um, and so Kant says that these specific ones, we could go have this go on to infinity, so we could have an infinite number of objects that have differentiating marks, and this could go on to infinity. So the specific can have an infinite number of things, but the general cannot. The general uh, has to have some finite number of marks, because otherwise, if there's an infinite way that the general could exist, then that sort of just negates what the general is. There's no feature of the general that we could say everything else that falls under it has, and that there is no thing that its species concepts have that are contained within themselves. There's no general concept contained within them, and so these have to be finite. But Kant says that and time, uh, that space and time have infinite marks, and so space there can be an infinite number of representations of space, and so there are so many different types of triangles you could have by just increasing each side by an infinitesimal amount. Uh, it's making them larger and larger, and then changing the angles by infinitesimal amounts and an infinite number of squares and an infinite number of circles and so on. And so there are an infinite number of things in space, of marks in space. So a single triangle would be a mark in space. And so there are an infinite number of them, and therefore space cannot be a general concept. Um, and so uh, this is trying to show that space is not a concept, but is actually an intuition, and is an a priori or pure intuition, because we cannot generalize it as a concept, and uh, therefore Kant says that space is a pure intuition. Uh, I mean, you can take these for arguments as you will. Kant thinks that they are convincing that space is subjective and an a priori intuition, and therefore are something that humans bring to bear. I find the first two arguments to be uh, a little bit more compelling than the second two arguments. Um, there seems to be a little bit more of a leap of logic, and you have to accept Kant's idea that of the distinction between uh, intuition, intuition, and concepts. Uh, and so you have to kind of buy into some of what Kant is already talking about earlier on in the book in order for these second two. And also you have to accept this sort of idea of the hierarchy of concepts and of concepts as genus and species. Um, so the next part, as I said, was what Kant called the transcendental transcendental exposition. Oops. Exposition. And as I said, I'll be talking of space, but uh, these can apply in certain ways to time as well, and I'll briefly go over those arguments after this. And so, as I said, uh, Kant says uh, Kant says the transcendental exposition of space is to show that space is a subjective representation that provides the ground for synthetic a priori knowledge. And uh, so he's saying that now that he has proven that space it, and time, as I said, but space is an a priori or pure intuition. He says that in the transcend or the metaphysical exposition, he's saying that he's shown that this is true, and now he wants to show that this is where things like math and geometry are actually grounded in, not grounded in not not in things in themselves, but grounded in our pure intuition of space. And so these are things that are sort of brought to bear by the mind once again, insofar as these are grounded in our intuition. And so that is how these can be a priori and synthetic. And so this, as I said, one of his main goals here is to show that synthetic a priori things can exist, and and these exist because math and geometry and other things that are synthetic a priori, but math and geometry are the ones that Kant often uses. That these, because they are grounded in space as a pure intuition, that these are a priori for one thing, but he also wants to show that they are synthetic, that we can actually obtain new information from them. Uh, and so that's to show that space, that the pure intuition of space is the source of these synthetic, so source of these synthetic a priori cognitions, he calls them. So cognitions. And so he wants to show, as I said, that math flows and presupposes space given by pure intuition, because math and geometry are only possible given space. And since space is part of the a priori or pure intuition, then if these can only exist given that space exists, then they can only exist given that humans are bringing space to bear on objects in themselves. Um, and so maybe we could show this as well. I have space, pure intuition here, and so he talks about that these are where the propositions or axioms of geometry come from, and that these sort of flow from or issue from our pure intuition of space. Uh, and so propositions would be things like, and once again, Kant likes to use the idea of a triangle, and so that's things like three sides and their internal angles uh, add to 180 degrees. And so Kant says that something like this is an a priori synthetic cognition, because this is something that goes beyond just the idea of taking the concept of three lines. So if this is a concept, and we sort of put those together, the concept of three lines plus maybe the concept of arranging them, arranging them, sort of moving them about in space, then that equals internal angles. So I'll just put angles here of 180 degrees. And so this is something that sort of comes out as synthetic. It's new information just by sort of putting these concepts together. We get this out of that. And so, as I said, given these propositions of geometry, we can then start obtaining synthetic cognitions, but these are also a priori, and they're a priori because they're based on this pure intuition of space. And so Kant also talks about this in terms of three-dimensionality, which I'll just write as 3D. And so he says that the three-dimensionality of space also precedes the representation of any particular 3D object. And so the idea of three-dimensional has to precede. So this precedes an object that is three-dimensional. And so this is just another, so this is space preceding the actual object and not being something that is inherent in the object itself. And he says, therefore, the subject, which is affected by the object, affected being appearance, appearance going to the person, and then sensation. So this is the way that it affects the subject. And so he's saying that the subject, which is affected by the objects, must contain the preceding intuition. So the subject must contain the intuition of 3D in order to sort of bestow that on the object. So therefore, space is subjective, and that's how Kant is trying to say that things like math and geometry, which are the ways that are things that we sort of bestow on objects. We understand objects as being geometrical, for instance, and therefore that stems from uh, our intuition of space. And uh, so just to kind of wrap this part up, he's saying that the propositions of geometry stem from our pure intuition. So these are understood uh, presupposing the space of our pure intuition, which Kant says he proved this in his metaphysical exposition. And so now he's trying to go further and say that things like math and geometry in particular are things that come from, that presuppose our pure intuition of space, that of space as a pure intuition. And so he is also saying that about down here about things as being three-dimensional. And so Kant also says this about time as well. And he gives actually five arguments instead of four for time, but they're all sort of derivative of his space arguments. And so I'll just kind of read off what I have on my notes here about the time one. So, uh, one, simultaneity and succession are grounded in time, the pure intuition. Two, you can't remove time from appearances, but you can remove appearances from time. Three, you cannot derive succession from experience. And so essentially saying that the idea that one thing comes after, or comes before another thing, which comes after another thing. We don't understand this succession idea of one thing preceding and another thing succeeding something else. We don't we don't get this idea from experience. This is something that we understand well as a pure intuition. And that's similar to what Kant says about how one object, so object one and object two, and the self are sort of understood as being separate from each other. This separation is not something that we learn from experience. It's something that we understand as a pure intuition. And then the fourth argument, so different times cannot be simultaneous. So that different times cannot be simultaneous is not derived from concept, but is synthetic and contained in immediate intuition. And so he's saying that if one comes before two, then our understanding that one is not also simultaneous with two, that these two things are mutually exclusive, one being simultaneous, and also one proceeding to. This idea is something that we get from pure intuition. It's not something that we had to experience. Oh, two came after one. Well, now I can understand that two is not simultaneous with one. That's something that is sort of understood in the pure intuition, that these are mutually incompatible. And then five, time is infinite and contains all concepts of time. And that goes back to that's a derivative of our argument up here about space having to have these finite, or space not having these finite marks or features that are required of a general concept. And he's saying the same thing of time, that time is in fact infinite, and he says that it's infinite insofar as all concepts of time are limitations on that pure concept of time. And so those are Kant's arguments for time also being something that is subjective and sort of imposed on reality by the human subject, and is therefore pure intuition and a priori. And so in the transcendental aesthetic, Kant then goes on to call what he has shown here to be his transcendental transcend transcendental idealism. And it's idealism because it's all subjective, that time and space are subjective. Uh, and transcendental is a little bit more of a, a word that I mean, because he uses it all the time, as we've already seen. So it's a little bit more vague, um, but it essentially means that it does uh, actually exist. And so he what he's the idealists, people in the vein of David Hume, or Berkeley, if you sort of remove his arguments about God. Uh, so idealism is essentially saying that what we perceive is not real, that there's an object out in space, and then there is our representation of it, which is inside our mind. And so we're not actually perceiving the object in itself. We are only perceiving our representation of it. And so we don't, there is sort of this veil of ignorance between our understanding and the object in itself, and that's what idealism is. But transcendental is essentially saying that this representation is also something that's real. And so Kant is saying that space and time, although they are subjective, are still real in a sense. That when we so that essentially saying that when we measure things in space and time, when we're doing physics, we're not just sort of just living as a brain in a vat, really, and sort of measuring nothing. He's saying that these do exist, but they just exist as something that is ideal. And that's this idea of transcendental idealism. And so Kant goes on in the transcendental aesthetic to say that we cannot have a priori cognition of mind-independent objects, which is what he's been saying, which is this idea of idealism, that we don't have, we don't cognize, we're not cognizant of this. We're only cognizant of our representation, and it is our representation which has space and time, not the object in itself. And so he says that we can't have a priori cognition of mind-independent objects, and therefore nothing can be intuited prior to the existence of the things to which they pertain, thus intuited a priori. And so what that's saying is that if something can't be intuited prior to the existence of the thing to which it pertains, so an object is out here, so it's this three-dimensional object which I've drawn very terribly here, and so we can't intuit the fact that if this object contained within itself space, we would not be able to intuit that, but only because space is intuited prior to the object to which it pertains. Then it must be intuited subjectively, that this is not something in the object itself, but is something that the subject sort of brings to bear on the object. And so he says that space represents no property at all of things in themselves. So space is something that the subject brings to bear on it. Um, so as I said before, Kant sort of uh, divides things up into intuition and concepts, and then he further divides this up into the a priori and the a posteriori. And so I can make a table for this. This is not something that Kant made in his book. This is just something that I've sort of put together to help understand it. And so the a priori intuition are things like space and time. And so the a posteriori intuition would be the senses. And so, as I said before, intuition is sort of that immediate sensation of the external world, and so that's why it's a posteriori, because it has to be for empirical or experiential. So that's what a posteriori is. So the senses are the a posteriori intuition. And so an a priori concept would be something that is analytic, and so it's analytic a priori. And then so a concept that is a posteriori would be things that are synthetic a posteriori. So as we said, that is the empirical. And Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Transcendental Aesthetic, wants to show that this is the case, that this is where that a priori intuition is where space and time occur. And so he does this by trying to eliminate these other things. And he eliminates these two by saying that that something that is a posteriori cannot be necessary and universal, because he says so Kant claims that things that are empirical are contingent. So these things are contingent, and so that would mean that space and time are things that we would have to sort of learn about from experience, and he has already sort of eliminated that and says that these cannot be the source of our space and time, our intuition of space and time. And he also rules out this essentially because it's not synthetic, and so things like math and geometry could not come out of an analytic concept, and since math and geometry presuppose space and time, then it could not come out of this analytic a priori, this concept, which, as I talked about in the previous video, an analytic a priori is a predicate, is a subject, is predicate, where the predicate is contained within the subject, or you could even say that there's a sort of an identity to these things, or he also said that this is that when you analyze concepts like this doesn't give new information. It's not synthetic. It's at best clarifying, but we're not obtaining new information from it. And so he says that The a priori intuition is the only place from which things like math and geometry could stem from. Um, and so that to sort of conclude here what Kant is saying. So I will use the his example of the triangle. And so Kant says that if a triangle existed that contained triangularity, so we're saying that triangularity is the property of being a triangle. He's saying that if a triangle contained the property of triangularity in itself, so independent of the mind. And so if the triangle sort of out there in the world, independent of the mind, contained triangularity in itself, then it would be a synthetic a posteriori and therefore contingent. So if this is the object out in the world, then it would be contingent. And Kant says that this is not the case because we can come up with the propositions or axioms of geometry a priori, and therefore it is not contingent. But he says also that if a triangle had triangularity contained in its concepts, so the concepts of three sides and the internal angles adding up to 180 degrees, then it would be analytic a priori, and it would give no new info. So if the idea of triangularity contained all of these concepts about triangles, then this would be something that's analytic a priori, which, as I said, is x is p, where p is contained, the predicate is contained in the subject. So if the triangularity was contained in the concepts, then that would make it analytic a priori. And so he says to be synthetic a priori, the triangle must issue from an a priori, which is before experience. So if the synthetic a priori of the triangle must issue from the a priori before experience, intuition, then that has to come from space, which as Kant said is an a priori intuition, and so this has to come before experience. And so to be a synthetic a priori, the triangle must issue from an a priori intuition, which is space. And that is the thrust of Kant's transcendental aesthetic. So the big picture that you should get out of this is just that space and time are subjective, and that is because they are pure intuition, and that means they are a priori. And the other sort of main thing to get out of this is that math and geometry come from this pure intuition of space and time. So these are not applied to objects uh, in themselves. In themselves, these are not. These do not come from objects in themselves, but from our pure intuition of space and time. And so these are applied to our experience, to the world of our experience. Uh, and so they're not applied to objects in themselves, but to objects as we experience them. So objects as we experience them. And so this is what Kant will later call the phenomenal world, and this is what he will later call the noumenal world, the phenomena and the noumena. And so this is sort of the main takeaway here of the transcendental aesthetic. And as I said, Kant's motivation for wanting to prove that space and time are not real is to show that math and geometry apply only to our experience and not into objects in themselves. And therefore, this will still allow for free will, because objects in themselves are not dictated by the sort of clockwork universe of math and physics, which is just sort of applied math. And so physics, like I said, it's transcendental idealism, in that Kant says that that this is real, that this is something real. We're not just sort of playing pretend when we do physics. Uh, but he's saying that there is this separation between the phenomenal and the noumenal, uh, and so and so this still allows for things like free will and the soul, the immortal soul, and God and things like that to exist, which is important, as I said, for Kant's for his moral philosophy, which he doesn't get into so much in the Critique of Pure Reason, but in his later works, like the Critique of practical reason, which when he talks about practical reason, he is essentially talking about morals and ethics, and that's where he comes up with his famous deontological argument, his deontological argument um, of saying that you should only do those things that you can universalize. So that's his categorical imperative. And I'm not going to get too much into that. Well, probably not at all, really, in this series of videos on the critique of pure reason. I may in the future do a series of videos on the critique of practical reason, um, but his critique of practical reason is all uh, predicated, is all based on this idea, on these ideas that he comes up with in the critique of pure reason, and space and time being subjective, being pure intuition, being a priori intuition, being pre experiential. So his moral philosophy is all based on this kind of idea here. And in the next few videos, I will go into the rest of of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, where he gets into things like the categories of understanding and so forth. So I will see you then.